Welcome guys, this is the Carrot Poker School and we're on to lecture 10 of grade 1. Today we're going to introduce a phenomenon that's probably talked about too much by people who are learning the game at this level, and that is basic blocker patterns. We're going to touch on how these affect texture as well. The reason I say that blockers are possibly over talked about is that they don't tend to have a massive effect on the swings of your EV. A blocker can make or break a decision where things are close, but it's rarely going to single-handedly drive a decision. The reason you hear top pros talking a lot about blockers is that they already understand the rest of the factors that affect EV very clearly, and so are almost freed up to start thinking about these deal-breaking factors, these things that swing a few percent equity here or there that tend to make a difference in the long term. But what we should be careful of is just going straight to blockers when we're missing more fundamental building blocks. So there's a very deliberate reason for me placing lecture 10 at the end of the course. Well, 10 is higher than all the other numbers, but also, why is this one lecture 10? Well, it really has to come after the more fundamental building blocks of your thought process, and I hope by this point in grade 1, you feel that you have a much better fundamental thought process than you did before. So let's add this on as an additional layer with a little bit of caution. So if we imagine that this is a wall of bricks, it's a wall of bricks, but let's imagine that the green bricks correlate to good hands and the red bricks correlate to bad hands. How strong an effect would removing a green brick or two have, do you think, on the overall distribution of green and red bricks? There are 128 bricks in this wall, 96 of them are green and 32 are red. So this means in our analogy that villain has a strong hand 96 out of 128 times. If this is villain's range, then that's how many green bricks there are compared to red bricks. Imagine that the green bricks are strong hands and the red ones are weak, and you have two blockers to those strong hands. You have two green bricks. What are you doing to villain's range? Now villain has a strong hand 74.6% of the time instead of 75% of the time. Clearly this is a bit arbitrary, but the point here is that blocker swings are minimal. I recently built an exploitative course for the Carrot Poker School. It's not part of the core syllabus, but I do run it periodically for people in my Discord group. And in that course, we talk about how exploitative considerations can very easily trump theoretical considerations such as blockers. And by doing a bit of research there, I actually found that the likely swings from having the best blockers for calling a bet all the way through to having the worst blockers were only about 4 or 5% equity max. So you can see why we have this blocker limitation rule, which says never make a decision based solely or primarily on blockers. If you've skipped things, such as being in a really favorable world and having tons of fold equity, and then you decline a bluff because your blockers don't look very good, you're doing things backwards. If you bet a hand that's in the middle of your range for a large sizing on the turn because you like your blockers, you're doing things incredibly wrongly, like so wrongly that you're effectively putting your socks on after your shoes. That's what you're trying to do. Poker players who aren't that experienced often do completely absurd things like this that are like the real life equivalent to something as egregious as trying to wear your socks outside of your shoes. Not that it's actually that harmful to anyone, but it's a very silly thing to do. But when you don't know a lot about the framework of poker, you can commit such parallel mistakes and not realize how absurd it is. So if you say something like, I had the ace of hearts so I bet the turn, but you were betting with second pair, having just big bet on the flop, then that makes absolutely no sense in most contexts, unless second pair is somehow good enough to be a value bet or bad enough to be a bluff. Do not let what you're about to see today taint your thought process in a way where you actually start to replace the more important and fundamental building blocks that we've introduced so far in the Carrot Poker School. I know I sound like a broken record, but I need to make this point extremely clear, and so let's make it even more. The insufficient reason trap occurs all the time in poker. It doesn't just happen with blockers, but blockers is one of the main culprit thought processes that fits into this category of leak. So whenever we conclude that we should take an action based on one factor alone while failing to engage with the rest of the relevant factors at play, we fall into the insufficient reason trap. Meet Adam. Adam suffers chronically from the insufficient reason trap. Look at his face. This looks like the face of a man who's very happy to take an action based solely on one reason. Very impulsive guy is Adam. Nice guy, but a bit impulsive, a bit rash. So here's a real life example first of the insufficient reason trap, just so you guys can clearly see how absurd the insufficient reason trap is. And I know that you're probably not like Adam and you wouldn't fall victim to this trap in real life. So here's Adam's predicament. Adam is going on a roller coaster and is trying to decide whether to bring soup on with him. He's hungry and very much in the mood to eat tomato soup, or tomato soup. I apologize if you're American. How would you feel about bringing the soup onto the roller coaster? Good? Bad? Would you be thumbs-upping this choice happily? Adam is. So why is Adam happily thumbs-upping the idea of bringing a piping hot bowl of tomato soup onto a roller coaster? He says, I like soup and I like roller coasters, so of course I'll bring the soup on with me. This is the thought process of a man who finds one positive reason to do something and then stops. Literally terminates the thought process at this juncture. Poker players do this all the time, and it's just as absurd and they don't realize. I'm going to give you another really extreme example from poker, but most of the ways in which people over-apply blockers in relation to the insufficient reason trap are not actually this ridiculous, but I'm going to give you a really ridiculous one. So later on that night, we'll follow Adam's day a bit further here, and without even changing his red splattered shirt, which he's obviously got soup all over from his previous blunder of taking the soup onto the roller coaster, he's playing 25 Zoom on PokerStars. He opens the hijack with ace of diamonds, 10 of clubs, and a recreational player calls on the button. So far so good. The flop comes king jack 10. Adam decides to check with his third pair plus gut shot. Pretty reasonable. Although I think betting is alright on a board with 3 high cards. 3 high cards tend to be incredibly good for the hijack range, especially the king jack and the 10, although this is kind of paradoxical because ace queen is probably one of the most common unpaired hands in button's range here, due to other ones getting folded and better ones getting 3-bet when it comes to offsuit broadways. But still, this is a very good board. Hijack decides to check. Button bets a B at 2,500, which is basically 2,500% of the current pot, which is 25 times the current pot. So this is an incredibly large jam for all of Button's chips, all in, and Adam has a pair and a gutter. What does Adam do? That's right, he makes a call. Because he blocks ace queen and he blocks tens. These are like the strongest hands in Button's range. Button doesn't have jacks that often, they're a 3-bet pre mostly here. He does sometimes. He doesn't have kings, that's a pure 3-bet here. King jack, king 10, these hands shouldn't really be strong enough to jam, but who knows, God knows what a player that jams this flop, just open jams, is doing. But Adam reasons that given that he blocks the best hands in the Button's range, there's absolutely no reason not to call. If I'm not going to call a hand that blocks both ace queen and tens, what am I going to call? The nuts. Basically what you should do when your opponent shoves for 25 times the pot is just call the nuts, because you're only meant to call a tiny percentage of your range, like 4 or 5% of your range. You can call here and just fold the rest, and because villain's risk reward is so appalling for villain, that's okay. You can give them nearly 100% fold equity, because when you call the nuts and they lose, you destroy them if they were bluffing. Of course, in reality, the Button range for making this play is probably just like very strong hands plus, and it's going to be a weak recreational player with a very strong hand. And therefore this call is absolutely abysmal. It's akin to just throwing away most of your stack, like probably 95% of your stack is going in the bin here. But Adam makes this play because he can justify it with one reason and then stop there. So whenever you find yourself, not just with blockers, but in general in poker, justifying a decision with one reason that doesn't actually capture the full EV picture of the spot, and this is tough because to get to the bottom of all of the factors that affect EV is tough, but don't bypass major ones, such as my opponent's range is just nutted hands. That's a pretty major factor that no one is bluffing with this line. It's a very widespread epidemic in poker. Doesn't just relate to blockers, but it does relate to blockers. And Adam is not alone. Adam is the extreme form of this leak. He's the mascot for this blunder. But you guys commit this blunder too. I commit this blunder sometimes as well. None of us are really above the insufficient reason trap, because it's very natural to take a convincing reason that appeals to us and act on it, especially with only 5 or 10 seconds in the time bank. Poker online is a game that's typically played pretty quickly. And even live poker these days is, shot clocks and stuff like that speeding up. So sometimes there's pressure on you and you do act on one reason alone for that reason. So today's blocker effects that we're going to be talking about, now that we've got our disclaimer out the way that you shouldn't just be a slave to blockers and ignore everything else, are going to be these. The first effect is going to be turn flush draw removal as the aggressor. So having a chance to barrel the turn or bet the turn and then looking at whether you block flush draws or not. Secondly, giving up relevant busted flush draws on the river. You reach the river with a hand that removes busted flush draws from your opponent's range. Or not, flip side. Raising the flop, backdoor flush draws and dead suits. It's not just about equity when you're picking your flop bluffs, it's also about blockers. Flush blockers when bluffing 3 flush rivers, so what if the flush actually gets there? What's the case there? Blocking the value range when bluff raising the river, another really important concept. So we'll start today with turn flush draw removal. This is one of the most common blocker effects ever, and I think it's a really important one to understand in the right direction. This is another one where there's definitely a widespread fallacy where people get this backwards, and I can understand why, but when you break it down, it's actually really absurd to get this backwards. So blocking, or removing combos, is all about removing the hands in your opponent's range that make a candidate play by you more likely to achieve its optimal result. If my optimal result is to get you to fold, I want to remove the hands that would call. So by removing calling hands, I can achieve my optimal result of getting a fold more often. What's the optimal result of double barreling, or c-betting the turn as a bluff? That's right, it's getting a fold. That's the optimal result. Whenever that happens, our EV is at its highest for that juncture in the hand. Of course, like there's times we hit the nuts and then get paid off on the river, but we'll ignore them for now. If we had to choose between villain folds, villain calls, and villain raises, we would of course choose villain folds before we've been able to hit our hand, because most draws miss and we don't usually make our hand, sadly. That's poker, folks, you know, as they say. Villain calls, this is bad. It's not the worst ever, at least we get to realize equity. It's definitely not the worst thing that can happen, because the worst thing that can happen is the villain raises. Therefore, we strive to block hands that would continue to our bet in some way, even if these hands aren't the greatest in terms of equity. Blocking is not just about blocking the nuts, it's about blocking any kind of continue, because getting continued against, getting raised, getting called, these things are much, much worse than getting a fold when you're bluffing or semi-bluffing. It's really crucial that we identify that fold equity going up is just a net win for us, and fold equity going down is a loss. So when it comes to understanding and isolating the factor of your card removal, your blocker effects, you want to block flush draws on the turn, because ordinarily speaking, flush draws are not part of your opponent's folding range very often for a small sizing, and that's because most flush draws have a lot of implied odds. Some have showdown value and pairs to go with them, and some bluff raise you when they don't. So this is why you want to block a flush draw. It's a hand capable of reinvesting against your investment, raising your bet, in other words, and that's bad. So on this turn card, you might not think about villain having a flush draw as being a particularly good thing here when this turn card comes down. But here's the thing, Queen 10 with a club and Queen 10 without a club are played fairly differently in Equilibrium. We'll come to Ace Jack in just a second. But if you have a think for a second about how you think these hands play and whether you would like to have a club here, I've kind of already spoiled it, but have a think about it. And yeah, that's right. You should crave the club in this spot. The Queen of Clubs is a card that is a positive thing for you to have when you're considering betting the turn, because when you bet the turn, you don't want to get raised, and a hand like Queen Jack of Clubs will raise you, a hand like Queen 9 of Clubs will call you, a hand like King Queen of Clubs will raise you, or call you, probably call you. Club hands are raising or calling here mostly. There aren't flush draws in villain's range that are bad enough that they have to fold to B75, apart from like maybe a couple of combos, but even like Queen 5 of Clubs is going to be doing a good amount of raising in this spot. So what we see is that the Queen 10 with the Queen of Clubs here is picked at quite a high frequency as a bluff. You want to have this hand in your range because it cuts down the amount of the time that your opponent can have the Queen of Clubs himself, and that in turn reduces your opponent's raise frequency against you. When you're building a strategy, there are two things you want to do in game theory. The first one is just make sure your EV for each hand you're playing is as high as possible by maximizing the EV of each hand in your range. You also in turn maximize the EV of your entire range, your entire strategy. So we want to make sure we're always doing that. So reducing calls and raises does that. Secondly, we want to be building a strategy that's not so counterable, that villain can't counter-exploit. And the reason why having the club in your betting range a lot makes your strategy less exploitable is that villain doesn't really get to raise some random air hand like King 5 of Diamonds anyway. It's far too weak to repolarize with. Even if we're building a bit of a sloppy blocker formulation of turn bets, villain still can't just raise like King 5 of Spades here. Oh, that's a gutter, maybe he can, like King 7 of Spades will never be able to raise, right? But a hand with a flush draw in it is sort of a break-even raise in Equilibrium compared to the next best line, which could be folding or calling depending on the caliber of flush draw and the sizing that villain's facing. But the point is that if you build your betting range with just diamond, spades, and hearts here and don't bet with one club, your opponent will have the sort of hand that's a very profitable raise against your strategy now, and he can raise it all the time. So we can go from like mixing raises to just pure raising flush draws. And that really exploits you when you're betting hands that unblock the flush draw that are also air at too high of a frequency. Actually in GTO, the primary concern is EV. And all sims are motivated to increase EV because that's the algorithm that Pile Solver or GTO Wizard or any other solver has, is necessarily and always to maximize EV for both a range and a hand, and to do that in the long term and also fade counter-exploitation from the opponent. And in order to fade that counter-exploitation, you have to be building a sensible strategy. So rejecting Queen 10 because you don't want a club is a very backwards way of doing it. And in fact, that sort of strategy would simply allow our opponent to raise every time they had a flush draw or even flush draw blockers with straight draws, because they'd be unblocking a bluff. So if you want to build the right sort of bluffing range on this turn, I mean, you could have some hands that don't have clubs here. gut shots, things like that. Even this hand is not an EV loss to bet at equilibrium, otherwise the solver wouldn't do it. It's just that if you get completely out of control with hands that don't have clubs in them, you make the flush draws just more profitable raises than they should be in villain's range. The same problem doesn't go the other way around if you were to bet the flush draw too often, because villain can't raise you with a hand like queen jack of clubs, and you don't want to allow him to raise that more frequently by failing to put enough blockers to those raises in your range. It's interesting, right? There's a kind of long-term meta thing going on here in the solver. The solver's not saying it's a mistake to bet with queen of diamonds, 10 of spades, and it's not saying you have to bet with queen of clubs, 10 of hearts. What it's saying is that the strategy of betting often with the club is way less counterable than the strategy of betting the other hand. But make no mistake, the EV of queen of clubs, 10 of hearts is higher than the EV of queen of diamonds, 10 of spades, no matter what you do. And that's because you'll block the outs to your opponent's draws, and you'll block hands that are very often going to win the pot from you one way or the other, regardless of whether you bet or check here. They're meant to bluff river a lot. If he has queen jack of clubs here and you check back, he's meant to bluff river. You want to block these hands. When it comes to this third hand, if you're going to be Adam and be blinded by blockers and just thumbs up the ace of clubs, let's go, you're going to neglect the fact that you have a lot of showdown value with ace high in a late position battle like button versus big blind on a low innocuous, I guess still lake-like board. This board is so far somewhere between a still lake and a choppy sea, and certain rivers will be clear choppy sea textures, others will be clear still lake textures. We've talked about this already. So this hand is a pure check. The blocker is better in the sense that villain has more ace high flushes here than queen high flushes, combinatorially speaking. However, if the hand has more check EV, then bluffing it is theoretically wrong, regardless of blockers. So blockers do not trump core concepts such as showdown value. That is very much what we're driving at here. I hope that example makes sense. There's a lot to unpack there. Go over this slide again if not, and look for these flush draw removing cards when you're building your turn betting range. It allows you to build a stronger, less counterable strategy where you're trying to remove the hands that will actually raise you the most, which is great. It's not to say it's losing to bet the queen of diamonds, 10 of spades though. Effect number 2 is giving up relevant busted flush draws. This is something that you very often have to do on the river, but not always. Giving up meaning you've got there with nothing and you elect to check and give up on the pot, accepting that you're almost always to usually going to lose, maybe always going to lose. Some flush draws have some showdown value when they miss, others don't. Most don't, because your opponent bluffs weaker stuff earlier and things like that. But the point is that most flush draws are give-ups, but I've said relevant busted flush draws in the title here, right? Not all busted flush draws are always give-ups, especially in certain other spots that are advantageous to you. But assuming that we are the aggressor, we're barreling, we're betting flop, betting turn, maybe getting to the river with a continuation bet opportunity, we're usually not going to be in a favourable spot. Blocking flush draws before they miss is usually a good thing, but after these hands have bricked on the river, they are no longer good hands with which to bluff. You don't want to have 2 cards, or even 1 card sometimes, to your opponent's busted flush draws on the river, because those tend to constitute the bulk of their folding range. There are some times where solvers actually get tricky and call busted flush draws that are very high showdown value ones like ace queen on the river because they beat all bluffs, and they actually unblock your bluffing range because you're not meant to bluff with the busted flush draw. It's all very meta, but this is something that can happen in equilibrium proper. So on a board like the following one, villain will be calling the turn with a lot of flush draws. This is just a fact. Villain here is big blind, we are hijack, so we b33 the flop, b75 the turn. So far so good. You don't really want to overbet on a board with 2 7s on it unless you happen to know that your opponent is incapable of slow playing trips on the flop sometimes, which they're meant to do. And then we reach the 6 of hearts river. This is not a favourable world for a hijack because note that big blind is contracted by condensing twice. This is going to allow big blind to catch up in terms of equity a lot and be a favourite. So even though hijack is in position with a nut advantage, big blind has a range that's just much stronger equity wise. And so the fold equity here for hijack is limited to the norm. It's not going to be in excess of the pot odds norm amount. What that means is that hijack doesn't have automatically profitable bluffs unless their blockers are favourable, and blockers that are actually bad are going to constitute losing bluffs here. So an example of 2 combos that are losing to bluff, and we can see this clearly in Pio because we've displayed the EV layout here to these hands. So we can see that queen 10 of spades, 10 9 of spades with relevant spades blocking, I guess we could say spades that are big enough that they do meddle with the opponent's ability to have flush draws. If we had the deuce and 3 of spades here, it'd be much less relevant, right? We wouldn't open that in the hijack, of course, but hypothetically it wouldn't matter as much. But these hands are making bluffing negative. The idea here is that the baseline fold equity is not in excess of the break-even point, and because these hands reduce villain's fold frequency, make it lower than it normally is, we're actually getting less fold equity now than we need to break even. Think of it this way. In a spot like triple barreling, unless the run out is amazing for you, like loads of your gutters get there and he wouldn't have those hands maybe, what's going to happen is that the average bluff, if you pick a bluff just at random, it's most likely to be 0 EV. So if you pick a bluff that has worse blockers than average, it's going to actually be negative EV, and therefore checking and winning none of the pot is going to be better. There's this thing called the burning building trap, where the student wants to bluff these hands because they can't win any other way. That's okay. An EV of 0 is better than an EV that's negative, in the same sense that you wouldn't run into a completely ablaze house just to pick up, like, I don't know, your wallet with your bank cards in it. You wouldn't do that. While it's the only way you can get them back is to run into the house before they get incinerated, that doesn't make it a good idea to run into the building that's on fire. So note that this is a neutral world because it's a triple barrel spot. We've not strengthened our range by calling, we've just been polarizing, and villain has been strengthening here by condensing. In other words, we have lots of air on this node, all our draws missed. Villain doesn't have as much air, he has some high showdown value flush draws that call turn, but doesn't have just like a ton of random unpaired cards here. Therefore, our average bluff is now break even, and our worst bluffs with negative blockers such as 2 relevant spades are going to be losing EV. So of course, when we unblock those busted flush draws, we commit no such error. And a hand like this that actually has positive blockers, you can take a minute and pause the video if you want to think about why. Assuming you've done that, the reason this hand has positive blockers is that it doesn't have negative ones for a start. So the king and queen here don't really block many hands that villain is folding, because of course villain would have folded the king queen of diamonds or something on the turn, and would have folded some other hands with these cards in them on the flop, like queen 10 off or king 10 off or something. And the other thing is that we block some jack X, some good jack X that might be calling a b75 on the river here. So you can see that the solver actually thinks that while queen 10 and 10-9 of spades are losing bluffs, coming in with an EV of around a third of a big blind, losing here, it thinks this hand is winning about a quarter of a big blind. So there's a swing of about half of a big blind here between having queen 10 and having king queen. As you can see, that is not a big swing. That will be eradicated in no time by an opponent that overfolds or over defends. So if you have a station here and you pull an Adam and say, I'm going to bet because my blockers are good, but villain is a massive station, king queen is a massively losing bluff now. It's awful. You can't just fall back on theory and say, well, in theory it's okay, so it's his fault if I lose all my money. No, it's your fault for not reacting to the real world conditions. Same thing with 10-9 of spades. If villain is a nit and you don't bluff this hand, even though your fold equity is way more than it needs to be to break even, because you have bad blockers, you're doing an Adam, you're taking soup onto a roller coaster. You're only thinking about one piece of the puzzle. We're teaching you blockers today so you can just never use them, basically, until you're happy with the other factors, of course. Another word of warning here, while we've said that busted flush draws are all else being equal bad, so in neutral worlds where bluffing is not inherently meant to be winning, it's bad to bluff these hands. We should be very aware that whenever your range has become far stronger than your opponent's, and remember, usually this occurs where he's polarized and then checked, right? And you've just condensed by calling. So something like river probe, where you call flop, turn goes check check, you have a betting opportunity on river. This is a very common spot where you'll have a range advantage as long as the board runs out in an innocuous way that preserves the status quo from the flop. In these spots, you may need to bluff with all hands that don't have showdown value. It might not even matter what your blockers are. Well, it will still affect EV, but all bluffs will be positive and all bluffs will be better than checking in worlds that are good for your range, bad for your opponents, and therefore worlds where fold equity is above and beyond where it needs to be for you to break even. Range asymmetry, inequality, is a far more important factor than blockers. Remember that no blocker effect is commonly great enough to compensate for these major factors. Blockers are a minor factor. A guy that never folds, or a spot that's amazing for one range and horrible for another. These are major factors. So Jack 7, 7, 4, 6, big blind check calls the flop. This time Hijack does not go ahead and bet on the 4 of clubs turn, and that's normal. Hijack will only be betting about, I'd say, like 45% of the time on this card. So checks back with a weakened, condensed / polarized range, kind of done a bit of both, but moved towards having nothing a lot of the time. And so when big blind lands here with nothing, because big blind's range is so Jack X heavy, also some 7X and some pocket pairs, it just doesn't have enough air to go around now, because the air would have folded on the flop to the small bet. The difference here, or the most striking difference between big blind's range and hijack's range on this node, is that big blind does not have anywhere near as much air as hijack has. Therefore, big blind's range is lopsided. It's actually asymmetrically strong compared to the hijack's weak range. So when we examine this so-called river probe opportunity, the big blind boasts such a large range advantage here that he or she just has to capitalize on that. Even hands with the worst blockers imaginable are a mistake to check to not bluff. You might look at ace-3 and be like, this hand is dreadful, why would I ever bet this hand? It has showdown value and it has terrible blockers. Why is big blind bluffing? The reason is that fold equity is through the roof. It's really high. Hijack has a ton of hands better than this, and a lot of them fold because big blind's range is by and large very strong. Note here that big blind just has a naked jack a lot of the time and can just block bet that hand or bet big. The sizing that's been chosen with these bluffs here, you can see they are betting because we have orange and red colors, not green. Green is check, remember. The sizing is whatever you want it to be, really. That's a bit of a cop-out of an answer, but there isn't necessarily a correct sizing for either of these hands on the river. The reason being that they get more fold equity the more money they invest, but they lose more money when called, so it's just a risk-reward kind of standard trade-off. Don't think that there's some magical sizing you have to use when you're bluffing. It's your value bets that are really sensitive to sizing, and what you should be doing is balancing your bluffs between different sizes in order to make sure that you aren't just like really value heavy in one spot and really bluff heavy in another. So you can see these hands are just generally mixing big bet, small bet, and medium bet. I wouldn't worry too much about the solver's exact preferences saying you can overbet ace-3 but don't overbet king-8. I guess the idea there is that the king blocker to the jack is only useful if you're betting smaller because the jack folds sometimes to an overbet anyway, perhaps. So I guess there's like little nitpicky things going on there, but don't worry about that. The idea is that you have to bluff both of these hands to get back to the main point here. And the reason you have to do that is that your fold equity is much higher than what it is on average in poker, right? Average fold equity is bet divided by total pot after bet. So if you B75 here, you're expecting around 43% in a neutral world. However, since this world is anything but neutral, the fold equity is much higher than 43% for ace-3. So even though you can check down this hand and even though it does block some folds, it's still a bet. Another really important point here is how bad are these blockers when turn is checked through? Like clearly we have to bluff the hand anyway, but these hands aren't even as bad blocker-wise as you would think because of course the hijack player is going to bet a lot of the time, not always because you know, in GTO, people aren't brain dead zombies that just always bet a flush draw on the turn. But the solver is going to bet at a high frequency with a king high and ace high flush draw on the turn, and also with air hands that contain one spade, right? We saw that the in position player is motivated to bluff more with one spade than with no spades on the turn. Therefore, these hands aren't going to constitute that much of hijack's air on the river. Hijack's air is actually more abundantly going to be two hearts, two clubs, two diamonds, a diamond and a heart, etc. because the hands with one or two spades bet more often on the turn, and thus they're eliminated on this node. That's kind of important that blockers are also dependent on action sequence. Typically speaking, when there's an aggressively played hand, having a busted flush draw blocker on the river is bad, and when the hand is played passively, it can actually be good. If this checked all the way to the river, some of the hands that big blind would be most incentivized to bluff the river with would be a busted flush draw, because hijack's air is not spade-like in that configuration where we check all the way to the river, because he bets a lot of those hands. So blockers are tricky. They're very action sequence dependent, as well as pre-flop range dependent and board dependent. So we give up here with basically nothing unless it has a ton of showdown value. Blocker effect number 3 is raising flop. Backdoor flush draws and dead suits. Dead suits are a really nice concept once you get the hang of them. When we're bluff raising a flop c-bet, the goal is to reduce the amount of the time your opponent continues. So again, optimal result when you're bluff raising the flop is getting a fold. And of course you could like find a sub branch of the tree where you hit the nuts and get paid off, but that involves not getting a fold, and by and large not getting a fold is worse than getting a fold. So we'll ignore that for now. Firstly, on a rainbow board, you can increase your fold equity and thereby increase the amount of the time that you get your optimal response and avoid the red X's by blocking the backdoor flush draws and unblocking the dead suit. The idea is that villain will be continuing more with a backdoor flush draw than a dead suit, basically, that can't ever make a flush. So you want him to have the dead suit more often. So in a rainbow board, there will be 3 suits that constitute live flush making suits and one that can never make a flush because there wasn't one of it on the flop. And so having the dead suit is going to be bad for raising the flop, both because your equity is going to be lower, but also you're going to reduce fold equity by incentivizing your opponent to continue more often by him unblocking the hands that he's actually continuing with and blocking the hands he'd be folding. On a two-tone, meaning flush draw board, you can do this with suited cards, which block the backdoor flush draw. So there'll be one card that's one suit and 2 cards of another suit. By having 2 cards to the backdoor flush draw, you can increase fold equity by blocking your opponent's backdoor flush draw hands that can call your raise. And there'll be 2 dead suits now. You can also block the flush draw here by blocking the front door one, being one of the card in your hand that gives you a backdoor flush draw, and block some of the front door flush draw, and even block some of the backdoor flush draw offsuit cards in your opponent's range too. So the two dead suits are the thing that you do not want to block. You want to unblock the dead suits. So if the board is heart, heart, spade, you don't really want to be raising with clubs and diamonds in your hand for the most part, unless you have other things going on like straight draws or whatever. When thinly value raising a flop though, for example with top pair, this is where it flips. You actually want villain to have a backdoor draw now, because you're value raising, right? And what is the goal of value raising? The optimal response that you're after actually flips. When you're bluffing, the optimal response is a fold, but when you're value raising, the optimal response is a call. So if the optimal response is now a call, you want to increase villain's call frequency, especially when it comes to villain having a bad hand that's the bottom of their calling range that you're doing really well against. So if villain has two clubs on a board with one club, he's just more likely to call than if he has the dead suit. So again, in these cases, we want to increase our optimal response happening, but this time because the optimal response is the opposite, we now actually want to block the dead suits when we have a pair and unblock the backdoor flush draw. Note that we're not going to extend this concept to front door flush draws. Front door flush draws are just really high EV, and when you have a pair, getting called by one is not a good result. Sometimes people fall into the trap of saying, but I'm ahead of a flush draw, so I must want it to call me. This is actually not true. If villain was by some miracle going to fold with a flush draw, that would be way better than them continuing, because the thing is that when villain has a front door flush draw and you have a pair, it's quite close to a flip, maybe you're slightly ahead, but in EV terms, the implied odds is more with your opponent, because your opponent is the one who's going to be able to extract way more money from you in the future if that gets there, whereas if you land on the river and he's bricked his draw, you don't earn a single other bet usually. Unless he bluffs and you've checked back turn or something, but that's a bit different. Then you don't get a turn bet. On Queen Deuce, rainbow, one dead suit here in its hearts, button range bets, which is a fairly reasonable strategy on such a dry board that has a queen in it, is fine. You could split here, you could range bet, it's not that important. But big blind decides upon a 4x raise. We should note that if button is range betting like they are here, R33 signifies a bet with range, big blind is going to be raising more aggressively, thinner for value, more liberally with bluffs, and a bit more merged as well with medium strength hands, sometimes. So Jack 9 here is a hand that raises really frequently, kind of bog standard, low to medium equity bluff, but Jack 9 of hearts never raises. This isn't just about equity. Of course you could say, but Pete, surely this is just because Jack 9 has more outs. It does, because there are nutted permutations here where Jack 9 just makes the immortal nuts and gets lots of money. Not quite immortal, but a very strong hand. But Jack 9 of hearts can never do that, so that's part of it, sure. But another thing is that it's just a fact that when you hold the Jack 9 of clubs and you raise this flop, you have more fold equity than if you held the Jack 9 of hearts. And that's because villain is likely to call with King Jack of clubs here, but not with King Jack of hearts. And have many other hands like that. Same with like Ace 9 or something, right? If we make this board two-tone now, we just change the suit of one of the deuces, and we go 4x raise here. What you'll see is that having this hand is really nice, like you want to raise this hand quite frequently, because having the Jack of Spades is going to, 1, cut back the number of flush draws your opponent can have, 2, eat up the outs of those flush draws if he does have them, making them more likely to fold by the river, and 3, unblock the dead suits, just unblocking the folding range, the heart, and the diamond air of your opponent. Note that range bet just keeps all of your opponent's range in the pot at the same frequency. If you were playing against somebody who actually never bet with diamonds and hearts here because they were just way too nitty on the flop, then it would no longer become relevant whether you unblocked or blocked those hands. And now you might actually want to like unblock clubs and block spades or something, but that's a different case. We're assuming here that villain has just bet all suits equally to reach this point, and I think that's a good thing to assume, because in your guys' game, like, a lot of your opponents are actually going to be playing this way where they're just betting everything on the flop a lot of the time. It's a lazy and convenient thought process, and the world is moving in that way where people do things that are lazy and convenient. Jack 9 of diamonds, this is a hand that you shouldn't raise here in game theory. Of course you could if someone was really nitty and just overfolding, and I would make this raise all day against someone that kind of range bet accidentally here and then didn't realize how to protect it. You have to defend very counterintuitively wide against raises here after you bet all of your range. It really affects the demands that are placed on you mathematically and therefore combinatorically to defend. But the point is, don't raise hands that block dead suits, because if you raise them, you get a fold less often, and your optimal response here is getting a fold. That's why the Jack 9 of the black suits is much better than the red cards here. And finally, In this sort of situation, you're going for a value raise, so you actually like the Queen Jack of Hearts, but we don't raise with the Jack of Clubs in our hand and a Queen, because now our optimal response is inverted. We actually want to get a call now, and so we want to unblock the low equity hands that call. Again, just to reiterate, we wouldn't extend this all the way to spades, because spades are hands that do too well against us for us to be interested in wanting to unblock those hands or go for value against them. They're just too high EV. Basically, the value is extremely thin if villain has 2 spades here, but if he has 2 clubs, it's very thick. So we want to avoid blocking the club, but we still want to block spades here. More happy value raising with diamonds and hearts as well. That's a bit tricky, but hopefully it makes sense. You can get the basic patterns that are going on there. Effect number 4 is about flush blockers on the flush river. So when the flush gets there on the river, instead of bricking, we've been looking at it bricking up until now, remember, things are going to shift dramatically. Suddenly, any hand that contains a relevant flush-making card becomes a far better bluff candidate and even a better thin value bet. This actually works both ways. Whether I'm bluffing or whether I'm thin value betting, it's still in my interests that you don't have a flush. Whenever I'm investing money into the pot, unless I have a better flush, you having a flush is a very bad thing for me, right? In this spot, ace, ace 3, deuce 8, hijack is tripling off here. And we can see that flush blockers do increase the EV of betting. You can bet bigger, bluff bigger generally, because the bigger you bluff, the more of your opponent's range will have a flush or a flush blocker. And it's important to note that you're not just looking to block flushes, but even if villain has an ace here, they may rather call ace 7 off. Okay, they don't have that here, but just for talking's sake, ace 7 off with the 7 of hearts than with the 7 of diamonds, because that blocks some of your king 7 suited, 7-6 suited that makes a flush. By having flush blockers, sometimes you're not even just blocking flushes, but you're blocking bluff catchers that prefer to call with the heart than without the heart. So the King of Hearts here is obviously a very good card to have, and one phenomenon that you guys will observe in game theory, and you'll see more as you progress through this Carrot Poker School experience into the grade 2 and grade 3, is the idea that certain bluffs are mandatory on really wet runouts based on their blockers. So as the runout gets more flush-like, you will want to have the flush card to bet above a certain size, and you'll want to give up without that card much more of the time. When you're thin value betting, the same thing actually happens as well, where even if you just have trips here and you're sort of saying, okay, I'm going to go for the final bet here, it's a bit thin, but I think I have maybe 70 to 80% starting equity in this node, and by the time I've bet and been called, I'll still be a favourite, even though I won't be a giant favourite. What happens here with the Jack of Hearts is that you reduce your opponent's flush combos considerably and thereby increase your equity when called. Note that when you don't have the Jack of Hearts, there's a lot less betting that goes on here for value, and the hand is much closer to a check because the landing equity here that I've pictured is just a bit too low. So the EV here that I've pictured, as you can see, is much higher with the heart in your hand than without. This is always a good thing when the flush gets there to have the card. Another semi-important point would be that sometimes a high heart on a 3-heart runout can bluff, but it might not even be as good a bluff catcher as a lower heart. And this comes down to the fact that while we are calling bets with all kinds of hearts, we might do better with the lower one because that will only block value bets, whereas the higher one can block offsuit cards that can block bluffs as well. So sometimes, like having the Jack of Hearts here, if you're bluff catching, might actually block the King X Jack of Hearts or the Queen X Jack of Hearts in villain's range that's bluffing, as well as some of the flushes. So sometimes it's kind of a balancing act trying to figure out, do I block more flushes or flush draws? And sometimes you just block a lot of both. But when you have a low heart like the 5 of hearts here, that can block like King 5 of hearts in hijack's range, but it can't really block any bluffs, because hijack doesn't have King 5 off with the 5 of hearts. Okay, on to effect 5. So blocking the value range when bluff raising the river. This is an incredibly strict rule, because when you elect to raise a river bet, it's not enough just to get villain's bluffs to fold. You don't want to fold out bluffs necessarily. If you had a hand that could beat bluffs, you would just call. So when we're raising the river, we're investing so much extra money that that wouldn't be worth it if we were only getting bluffs to fold, unless villain was way over bluffing. So if this was our only goal, we could merely call. If we just wanted to get bluffs to fold, we could call, since our showdown value just beats bluffs anyway. So we would just simply revert back to calling showdown value and folding non-showdown value, basically calling all bluff catchers. If we thought villain was over bluffing, if we thought it was under bluffing, we'd call less bluff catchers, but we wouldn't be raising with air just to try and fold out air, right? And you don't really want to raise with total air very often on the river unless you have very useful blockers. And oftentimes, the only way you can have a useful blocker for raising the river is if you block a pair. So sometimes you'll see hands like low pairs turning themselves into bluffs on the river because they block some of the sets in 2 pair in the opponent's range. Therefore, when you raise the river versus a very polarized range, you're always incentivized to use blockers to villains' value range, because you need to extract some fold equity from value hands as well as against bluffs. And this very often means raising pairs, but always means thinking about what villains' value range is likely to be and how to actually block it. So in this spot, we've gone ahead and fired 3 times and faced the raise from big blind. The question is, what is big blind raising here as a bluff? What do you think big blind's bluffs are? What would big blind like to avoid raising? We know that because big blind is repolarizing, that big blind needs to extract some fold equity from hijack's value range as well as from hijack's bluffs. If big blind's sole motivation for calling was just to beat jack 10, why would they invest extra money? Why would they raise? The reason that raises happen here is that big blind can have a value hand like queen 5 or queen x that's good enough to raise here for value, and will therefore want a tiny bluff frequency as well. I will note here that it's a very low frequency of the time that big blind has a hand strong enough to raise in this spot in the first place. It's a very rare node to have a value raise here, so bluffs need to be very strictly and carefully chosen. They need to be scarce in the overall strategy. But this is what some of them look like. The little trace of pink here for ace 3 of hearts indicates that this hand can raise. Is this a value raise? No, because note that the 3 doesn't play. This is basically turning a pair of aces into a bluff, and in doing so, you're blocking some pocket aces, ace queen, pocket 3s in your opponent's range. You're basically blocking hands that would be very strong and would therefore just never be folding to a raise. With king 3, it's a similar thing. Note that the king of spades is not a bad card here because villain is not, as we saw, incentivized to be bluffing with missed backdoor flush draws that contain relevant spades like the king. That would be a give up for him, so this doesn't actually block villain's bluffs. Therefore, it doesn't block his folds. And king jack of diamonds is just a very good hand for blocking queen x. So when you're raising here, you're trying to purposefully choose hands that block the right stuff. You wouldn't want to raise here with a hand like 5-4 of spades, because that hand doesn't block as much 2-pair, doesn't block as many sets, and also just doesn't have any blockers to the queen x region of villain's range. Same with like 10-9 of spades or something doesn't seem quite as good. Either these hands just seem to be, they probably don't reach this node because they raise turn and stuff anyway, or they fold, but in principle they're not as good as just having the 3 or having like the 2 big cards to block the queen or something like that. So you can see how this works. If we're going to raise the river, we normally want to block value bets in villain's range, because we're not just trying to get fold equity from air, we're trying to get fold equity from value bets too. So these blocker effects, I will say, take them with a pinch of salt, because they are not a massive part of the game tree. Another thing to add here just before we move on is that bluff raising the river versus a polar range is really different to most of the spots we normally face. Normally when we're bluffing against a condensed range. So sometimes blocker effects can be more important than showdown value when you're against the polar range, because the idea is that all the showdown value is the same anyway. It doesn't really matter here in this spot whether you have king high, jack high, or 6 high. You still have a hand that can't really win by calling and could never consider calling, so you just basically look at your blockers, right? So we're not trying to bluff with the bottom of our range here. It's a fallacy that we could be like, oh, we have 7-6 of spades here, let's bluff with the bottom of our range because it's the worst hand we can have. There's no logic to that at all. The only reason you do that in some spots is that you could check for positive EV. If you can't call for positive EV here, then there's no reason to select your bluffs from the bottom up like that in terms of showdown value. So yeah, take all of these effects with a pinch of salt. This lecture is probably more confusing than it is important at this point in your career to really understand all of this. There's a lot of complex stuff in here, but blocker effects are complex. But I hope I've kind of shown you some really common blocker effects that matter, while at the same time showing you that blocker effects overall perhaps matter less than you might think. So, congratulations guys on reaching the end of grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School. I hope you've enjoyed it, I hope you've got a lot out of it. What now? Well, we have an exam, and after revising the course, I definitely recommend watching lectures twice, going over the notes again, and just making sure that you drill these spots in your GTO trainers and your hand history replayers, talking with friends, just making sure you discuss the concepts as much as possible. After you've done that, what you could do is try the exam. You'll find the exam in the folder which you got when you downloaded this course, or if you downloaded the full scholarship, you'll have got 3 exams in 3 separate folders. But what you want to do is go through that and actually sit down and dedicate maybe 3-4 hours. I'd estimate that the grade 1 exam will probably take you like between 2 and 4 hours depending on your level, maybe faster for some of you. And yeah, dedicate some focused time like you would in university. This is a academic style course after all, to go through and try and answer each question in detail. The Carrot Poker School is difficult, it's dense, And so I do highly recommend that you engage with the exam in a thorough and meticulous way, a professional way. Of course, you have the option of just skimming it, writing down some half-assed answers. You have the option of just going straight to the feedback video and spoon feeding yourself as well. But I would say don't just go straight to the feedback video. Spoon feeding doesn't work in poker. It never has. That's why when I coach, I'm always asking students, what do you think? What's your thought process like here? And how can we uninstall bad thoughts and reinstall good ones? We don't want to be just saying to a student, do this, do this, do this because of this. You need to be careful. So spoon feeding should be resisted at all costs. So do have a go at the exam if you can make the time. And then once you've done that and you've got your feedback by watching our feedback video, you'll find that in the folder you got when you downloaded the course as well. You can watch me basically go over all of the answers and show you some stuff from Sims and show you the optimal way to get 100% in the exam. Effectively, I made the exam, so I ought to be able to get 100% in it. And when you've done that, it's on to grade 2. Maybe you've bought our full scholarship already, in which case, good job, you've saved yourself £500, or who knows, maybe there'll be other discounts in the future, but probably you've saved at least £500 on this, and you can just go ahead and move on to the next grade. If you've just bought grade 1, fair enough. You may want to purchase grade 2 now, or even purchase the full scholarship and move on to another grade. It's often important to see that although this has been a ton of information, it's still a very small amount of what you need to learn in poker to become a proficient player. There's so much more theory to get under your belt in order to become strong. And if you like the Carrot Poker School, it makes sense to continue learning in this way, if this worked for you, right? Hopefully it did, or you wouldn't have even made it to lecture 10. I'd like to think those of you watching this are already pretty happy with the way the content is presented and taught. So I hope to see you all on grade 2, and I hope it's been a pleasurable and enjoyable experience. Good luck in the exam. This has been Pete Clark, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye for now.